Wyden.
Thank you, Chairman Nelson, and thank you, Chairman Bernanke. I want to ask you a little bit more about the shocks to the economy that you have been discussing. You talk about the pace of the recovery being slow, and particularly for the millions of people who are hurting, unemployed, underemployed, and that all of this really comes together as part of a sluggish expansion that's left the economy vulnerable to shocks. So I can see plenty of shocks. The payroll tax debate bogging down into a quagmire and talking about 2 months or another short-term effort. We mentioned Europe as another one. Mentioned the question of sequestration, and to me, that alone puts a very negative spectacle out, because it would mean that in a lame duck session of the 2012 Congress, you'd see again the same sort of flailing that you did after 2010. So my first question to you on the shock issue is, doesn't it serve to shock our economic system just to have all this delay and week after week of bickering and inability to get decisions on whether it's payroll taxes or others? Isn't that in and of itself a shock to the system in terms of what it does to business confidence and predictability and certainty?
Well, policy uncertainty is certainly one of the things that businesses complain about. It makes it harder to plan. We face the same issue as regulators with regulatory uncertainty, and obviously, to the extent that greater clarity can be provided, it would be helpful to the economy.
Is it fair to describe that as yet another shock to the system? Because to me, everything I've been trying to do, I'm going to ask you about tax reform here in a minute, has been to try to figure out how to force action early. Because when you don't, what you're most likely at a time when you have this sluggish expansion to see these shocks and a reduction in confidence and predictability and the like. So is it fair to say that delay in this kind of climate, when it comes to getting the payroll tax issue worked out and others, that in and of itself is a shock to the system?
Well, I would cite the example of the debt ceiling debate last summer, which was clearly a shock and very palpably affected consumer confidence and financial markets. More generally, loss of confidence that agreement will be reached, or uncertainty about what agreement will be reached, is a negative for confidence.
Let me ask you about the question. I mean, to me, the antidote to economic shocks are the cushions, the kinds of cushions that start us on the road to predictable, more certain kinds of opportunities to promote economic growth. And tax reform strikes me to be right up at the top of the list. And as you know, the super committee, we have Senator Portman here, who's done very good work on this, did it in the super committee. A lot of that work has been done now. I mean, there are tough political calls to be made, of course, to address tax reform, but the principles are pretty clear. Much of what was done in 1986, clean out a lot of the junk, the special interest breaks, to hold down rates and keep progressivity. Wouldn't long-term predictable tax reform be the kind of cushion that would help address the shocks that you're concerned about for the economy?
Predictability is good, and also a good tax code in itself promotes growth. I think most economists agree that a simpler, fairer, broader base tax code would be constructive for growth, yes.
And on the converse of it all, wouldn't piecemeal changes, where again we go through another round of temporary credits, temporary extensions, modifications to this provision, that provision, wouldn't that contribute to the uncertainty and the lack of predictability that would make it hard for us to grow?
Well, Senator, as you fully appreciate, politics is complicated, and sometimes not everything is feasible, and from a political point of view, but from an economic point of view, obviously the more comprehensive and clean the tax reforms or spending reforms can be, the more likely they'll be good, efficient from an economic point of view, and the more likely they'll reduce uncertainty.
I think your points are well taken, Mr. Chairman. My concern is, absent the kind of comprehensive reform that I think would be as strong a cushion to the shocks that you're talking about, I just hope that the country will see how important it is to steer away from yet more piecemeal kinds of changes that make this broken tax system even more dysfunctional and don't give businesses and consumers the predictability they need to generate the growth that you are talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.